The beginning in a serene city. In the tranquil folds of Japan's rural Nagano prefecture sat a quaint little town, nestled between rolling hills and idyllic countryside. Here, the rhythm of life moved quietly, punctuated only by the laughter of children playing or the occasional hustle of a bicyclist weaving through narrow streets wrapped in the embrace of maple trees. This was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other, where the elderly sat on benches, cheerfully reminiscing, and shopkeepers greeted even passers-by with a warm nod. It was a haven, a sanctuary of simplicity. Amongst its residents was 16-year-old Yukiko Aima, a high school student at Nagano Secondary High. Yukiko was not the type of girl to stand out in a crowd. She didn't dress flashy or act boldly, but she'd capture your attention nonetheless. With soft, almond-shaped eyes that held dreams bigger than the hills around her and a shy yet sincere smile, Yukiko embodied a gentle spirit, reserved, hard-working, and most of all, hopeful. What made Yukiko so special was her love for art. Since childhood she'd been inseparable from her sketchbooks, whether drawing under the shade of the ancient cherry blossom trees in the nearby park, or experimenting with colors on the floor of her modest sunlit bedroom. Her illustrations told stories she was too bashful to speak out loud. Her dream, clear and singular, was to become an illustrator, not for fame or money, but simply because drawing was the only way she knew how to communicate her heart to the world. Life at home was simple. Her family of 4 lived in a small but cozy house from which they could see the gray slopes of Mount Asama in the distance on clear days. Her father, Takashi, was a factory machine operator, a sturdy but quiet man whose hands were as calloused as his attitude towards life. He worked tirelessly to keep his family well-fed, and to retain some semblance of warmth in their struggling household. Her mother, Akiko, stayed at home, managing the chaos of daily life, preparing meals, and supporting her children's aspirations the best way she could. Yukiko had an older brother, Kenta, who had joined the workforce early and was currently apprenticing as a carpenter, while her little sister, Haruna, still had the rosy cheeks and endless energy of a 7-year-old who thought the world was nothing but kind and infinite. Financial struggles weren't unheard of in the Aima household. They'd never have considered themselves poor, but neither could they afford luxuries. Flashy clothes? Unnecessary. Personal desires beyond the practical? A luxury they never dwelled upon. Yet despite their circumstances, love echoed in their small home. Mealtimes were filled with chatter, as Haruna animatedly shared her school adventures, or Kenta bragged about a chair he'd finally mastered crafting. And Yukiko always maintained this image of the dutiful daughter, helping her mom fold laundry, taking little Haruna out for walks in the evening, and always keeping her grades pristine. Yukiko's days followed a predictable cadence. School in the mornings, part-time shifts in the evenings, and art sessions squeezed somewhere in between. Most afternoons after school you'd find her rushing through gravel roads on her old squeaky bicycle towards moonlit coffee, a warm little cafe that was her workplace. The cafe became her second home, a place where the regulars adored her politeness, and her colleagues appreciated her consistency. She worked to ease her father's financial burden, but she secretly hoped to save enough to purchase proper art supplies or enroll in online art classes. And though her life seemed monotonous from an outsider's perspective, Yukiko didn't mind. To her, this quiet pace of life felt like security. Nagano was no Tokyo. There were no bustling skyscrapers, no blinding neon lights, but Yukiko was okay with that. Tokyo represented the unknown, the overwhelming. Nagano was her bubble, her safe corner in the giant puzzle of the world. Yet, as reliable as her days were, it was impossible to forget the weight of her dreams and the challenges that came with them. She'd sometimes sit at the window late at night staring into the dark, whispering her ambitions into the whispering breeze. Deep down, Yukiko longed to break free from the cyclical constraints of her rural life, to paint on canvases she'd never seen, to illustrate tales inspired by worlds far beyond the bounds of her little town. One day, she'd tell herself, gripping the worn pencils in her hand, I'll create something that matters. Unbeknownst to Yukiko, this little world she took comfort in, this peaceful mundane existence she cherished, was about to shatter. The bubble she'd lived in for so long, her belief in the good hearts of strangers, the safety of her routines, it was all an illusion. In a town where crimes were rare and neighbors trusted one another, no one could have anticipated that their seemingly serene community would become the stage for one of the darkest stories anyone could imagine. The fateful encounter. It was just another evening in the quiet town of Nagano, the kind of night that Yukiko often found herself relishing on her way home. The air was cool, but not biting. with the faint scent of autumn leaves wafting through the empty streets. She had just wrapped up a long shift at the cozy cafe she worked at, and though exhausted, there was a sense of accomplishment glimmering in her eyes. Pedaling along the gravel path on her squeaky old bicycle, Yukiko couldn't help but let her mind wander. She thought about the sketches she'd left unfinished on her desk, ideas waiting to be brought to life in her sketchbook. That familiar sense of satisfaction from a day's honest work, paired with the peaceful solitude of an evening ride home, often gave her room to dream. Tonight, however, that peace was fleeting. As she approached a dimly lit intersection on a stretch of road where the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, Yukiko noticed the faint hum of a motorbike approaching from behind. At first, she didn't think much of it. The occasional motorbike passing by wasn't exactly unusual in small towns like hers. She moved slightly to the side, giving the rider ample space to pass. The sound of the engine grew louder, more insistent, and then, out of nowhere, it happened. The rider swerved aggressively, overtaking her and kicking out at her bike with a violent force. The impact was immediate and jolting. Her grip on the handlebars faltered, and before she could register what was happening, the bicycle toppled beneath her. She hit the ground hard, her knees scraping against the rough asphalt as her bike clattered a few feet away. For a moment, the sharp sting from her scraped skin drowned out the panic. Instinctively, she tried to regain her footing, her palms pressing into the rocky road beneath her. But before she could react further, the motorbike sped away as suddenly as it had appeared, its taillight a fleeting red dot disappearing into the obscurity of the empty road. "Hey, are you okay?" called a voice from behind her, startling her even more than the attack itself. She turned her head, wincing as she shifted her injured leg. It was a young man, probably only slightly older than her, jogging toward her. His clothes were casual and his expression was one of genuine concern, or so it seemed. He gestured to her fallen bike as he closed the distance. "That guy was crazy. You're lucky you didn't get hurt seriously." Yukiko blinked, the residual adrenaline clouding her ability to fully comprehend his words. There was something disarming about his manner, friendly even. She nodded faintly, muttering a soft, "Thank you," as he reached down to pick up her bicycle. "Let me help you," he offered. "It's not safe around here. What if he comes back? Guys like that, they don't give up so easily, you know?" The rational part of her wanted to politely decline. Something about the situation felt off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Maybe it was the overly eager way he spoke, or the way his eyes scanned her over as though sizing her up. But she was shaken, tired, and sore from the fall. The idea of having someone escort her home did feel comforting, even if it was this stranger. "Thank you, but my house isn't far, I can manage," she tried, her voice quiet but steady. The young man shook his head firmly, offering a smile, though there was something thinly veiled behind it. "Nah, you're shaken up. Let me at least walk you part of the way. Don't worry, I'm not a bad guy." Reluctantly, Yukiko nodded. She dusted off her skirt, her scraped palms stinging painfully as she gripped the handlebars of her wobbling bike. As they walked, the young man seemed to chatter effortlessly, but Yukiko was too busy wrestling with her lingering discomfort to fully engage. They hadn't gone far when he suddenly slowed his pace, looking around at the now deserted street. The once concerned tone in his voice shifted, becoming lower, rougher. "Hey, you know, I've seen guys like him before," he said, referring to the biker. "You can never be too safe. My advice? Don't trust people so easily." The words struck her as odd, cryptic even. Before she could reply, he stopped walking entirely, standing ominously close to her. His once friendly demeanor was now completely gone, replaced by something darker, more predatory. His smirk turned cold. "Actually," he began, leaning in closer, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm just like him." A cold chill ran through Yukiko's body as reality snapped into horrifying focus. "This isn't a safe place for you to be, Yukiko, but lucky for you, I can make sure nothing bad happens. If you cooperate." His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, as though he enjoyed the fear he was instilling in her. "What do you mean? How do you know my name?" She tried to step back, but he grabbed her wrist with alarming speed. "Oh, we know more about you than you think," he muttered, a twisted grin spreading across his face. It was then that Yukiko realized this was no chance encounter. She had been targeted. Before she could scream or even process the weight of the situation, another figure emerged from the shadows nearby, then another, and another. A group of young men, their faces alight with malevolent anticipation, gradually encircled her. The world seemed to spin as panic gripped her chest like a vice. "Let me go," she managed to whisper, though her voice was thin and quivering, but her cries fell on deaf ears. One of them, the one she now recognized as the same man on the motorbike, laughed smugly. "Don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to get to know us." Yukiko's heart sank as they pushed her toward a waiting van. The reality she had always known, the peaceful, predictable life in Nagano, shattered in an instant. Whatever lay ahead was shrouded in terror, but one thing was certain: this encounter would forever alter the safe world she thought she knew. Trapped in the House of Horror. When Yukiko came to, the world around her was unrecognizable. Her head throbbed from the blow she had taken during her abduction, and her vision still blurred from shock. All she could make out was the dim light of a flickering bulb above her. As her surroundings came sharper into view, she realized she was in a cramped, filthy room. The wallpaper had long since peeled away, leaving behind streaks of mold and grime that climbed up the cracked walls. The air felt thick with the stench of mildew and spilled alcohol, smells so vile they burned her throat with every breath. She was alone, sitting on a damp wooden floor with her wrists tied tightly behind her back. Her heart raced as she tried to piece together how she'd gotten here, and the events of the previous evening came rushing back in brutal clarity: the motorbike, the strangers, the van. She had been hunted and caught like prey. The faint sound of muffled voices seeped through the paper-thin walls. Men's laughter echoed faintly. It was carefree, light-hearted, and made her skin crawl. The tone of their voices didn't match the sinister undercurrents of her predicament. It was as if her presence here held no more weight to them than a toy or a fleeting source of entertainment. She knew she wasn't being held for ransom or any plausible reason she could rationalize. It was something far worse. Before she could dwell much longer, the door creaked open. Light poured in, and in its glow stood Hiroshi, the young man who had lured her into this nightmare. Gone was the concerned face he had worn during their first encounter. Now, his true self had emerged, cold, unflinching, and calculative. "Well, look who's awake," he said, his tone bordering on mocking. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, as if he were surveying his newest possession. Yukiko glared at him, doing her best to appear defiant despite her trembling body. Why are you doing this? Let me out of here!" she demanded, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. Hiroshi merely smirked, stepping further into the room until he was towering over her. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't some bad dream, sweetheart. You're not getting out of here, not anytime soon." The weight of his words hit her like a freight train. Before she could respond, two other figures stepped into the room, laughing to themselves. They were younger than Hiroshi, but the gleam in their eyes held something deeply cruel. One of them lazily kicked over a chair to sit on, while the other inspected her like she was nothing more than an object up for auction. "She thinks someone's gonna come looking for her," Hiroshi continued, addressing his companions with a chuckle. "That her family's gonna save her." He then crouched down to Yukiko's level, his face mere inches from hers. "They won't, because we're going to make sure no one even knows where you are, Yukiko." Her name on his lips felt vile, taunting. Any illusion of safety she might have clung to evaporated in that moment. The house as a prison. The next few days blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Yukiko barely knew whether it was day or night. The windows were nailed shut and covered with old, stained curtains. Her room was a glorified prison cell, barely large enough to lie down in, void of furniture apart from a single worn-out mattress stained with God knows what. The gang would cycle in and out of the house. Sometimes there were 3 of them, other times, more. They never let her out of their sight for long. Even when she was alone in the room, she could hear them just on the other side of the door. Their loud drinking sessions, violent shouting matches, and crude jokes created a sinister cacophony that filled the entire house. They had robbed her of her dignity early. She was stripped of her belongings, her bag and phone taken for keepsakes or leverage. Her clothes were torn from her body, leaving her vulnerable and humiliated. They taunted her relentlessly, calling her names, mocking her pleas for help, and laughing as she cried alone in the dark. At first, she was tasked to clean up after them. Whether it was scrubbing the reeking floors in the kitchen or picking up their mess from drunken nights, the gang found every excuse to assert their power over her, making her labor until she was too weak to stand. But it wasn't enough for them. They wanted entertainment. A portal to hell. On the 3rd night, one of them, a stocky, broad-shouldered boy with a scar running along his cheek, dragged her from the room. "Come on!" he sneered, his grip on her arm like iron. "You're the guest of honor tonight." She struggled, pulling back with every ounce of her strength, but he only tightened his hold until her skin burned under his fingers. "Please," she whimpered, fighting back tears, "please, don't do this!" But he ignored her. In the living room the others were waiting, beer bottles littered the space and the sour smell of sweat hung in the air. They jeered as she was shoved forward into the center of the room. One of them grabbed a video camera from the corner, pointing it at her with a grin that made her stomach churn. "Dance for us, Yukiko!" someone demanded. She froze, shaking her head emphatically, but the refusal only provoked their anger. Bottles were thrown, curses spat. Her protest was met with slaps. They screamed at her, their voices venomous, until eventually, even through the haze of her terror, she realized resistance meant more pain. Secrets began to form within her. The only way to survive was to do what they wanted, but even giving in didn't sate them. Their games grew crueler with each passing day. They paraded her around the house, forcing her into humiliating acts while they laughed, cheered, and encouraged each other to push the limits of their depravity. The weight of helplessness. Every time Yukiko thought they couldn't be more monstrous, they found a way to sink lower. Physical pain was their favorite tool of control, twisting her arms, shoving her to the ground, kicking her until bruises bloomed across her body. Then there were the threats, promises that if she dared to disobey or attempt escape, they would find her family and take care of them, too. Hiroshi often whispered these words to her in private, his tone calm, almost casual, as though discussing the weather. At night, when she was locked back in her room, Yukiko would let herself cry for as long as she could before exhaustion overtook her. She thought of her family, her father's quiet strength, her mother's gentle touch, Haruna's laughter. Did they know she was missing? Were they looking for her? Or had they too been ensnared in the gang's web of threats? The house became her universe, small, suffocating and full of horrors. Each day drained her of hope, but somewhere deep inside a flicker of resilience remained. A small, stubborn belief that someone might save her before it was too late. The first acts of torture. When the first sharp sting of pain hit her, Yukiko wasn't ready for it. She flinched as Hiroshi's cold laughter echoed in the small, suffocating room. Her stunned expression only seemed to amuse him more. That was how it began. Her torture transformed into a morbid game, an indulgent amusement for the gang. No sooner had she been stripped of her physical freedom than they began to strip away her pride, treating her not as a human being, but as if she were their plaything, disposable and wholly at their mercy. "What's wrong, Yukiko?" Hiroshi sneered, his voice laced with mocking amusement as he crouched in front of her. "I thought we told you, you're one of us now, better get used to it." Her refusal to answer earned her the first slap, loud and stinging across her cheek. She felt her head snap to the side, the searing heat of his palm imprinting itself on her soft skin. There was no time to recover. Another slap followed, then a hard shove that sent her reeling to the floor. The other boys, watching intently, whistled and hooted, as though it were some twisted form of entertainment. "Get up!" one of them barked, while another kicked her side sharply with the toe of his dirty sneaker. She doubled over, clutching her ribs instinctively, but the action only provoked more cruelty. "Did I say you could touch yourself?" The room filled with laughter, sharp, cruel, devoid of sanity. To the gang, this wasn't real pain or real trauma. In their eyes, Yukiko's tearful protests were little more than a mild inconvenience. Their world removed them entirely from empathy, deeper and darker than anything she could have imagined. By the end of that first night, Yukiko's body bore the marks of their fun, bruises blooming like dark, angry petals across her arms and torso. Her wrists throbbed from the scratches of the makeshift ropes they used to tie her up, and though her tears had long since dried, her cheeks tingled where the salt had burned. Escalation of control. The cruelty didn't take long to escalate. The more they saw the fear in her eyes, the more power they felt. They probed at her weaknesses, looking for reactions, for cracks in her composure. Sometimes it started small, forcing her to bow her head in submission, berating her when she didn't respond quickly enough. Then there were the indignities, moments where she was stripped of her clothes and made to kneel while they circled her, jeering and teasing like predators taunting prey. "You're so quiet, Yukiko," Hiroshi stated mockingly one evening, leaning down to her eye level. "What's the matter? Don't you want to fight back?" He tilted his head as if genuinely curious. "Or are you realizing that no one's going to save you?" "Please." Her voice cracked, barely audible. "Please what?" he snapped. "Speak up!" He slammed his hand down on the wooden floor beside her head with enough force to make her flinch. The motion made the others roar with laughter, slapping their knees as though it were the funniest thing they'd ever witnessed. The gang didn't just thrive on her fear, they feasted on it. Over the course of that week, they took turns herding her through the house like a caged animal, issuing commands and punishing even the smallest delay. Clean the floors, fetch their smokes, bring them food. And when she completed a task, they'd deliberately toss everything onto the ground again, laughing as she scrambled to pick it all back up. "Faster, Yukiko!" barked one, his voice dripping with false urgency as he stomped his foot. "What, are you stupid?" By the second day she could feel her willpower wavering. Her limbs grew heavier, her body weaker with every passing hour. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but it paled in comparison to the despair that was starting to take root. A game of breaking spirits. One cold night, Hiroshi came up with another game. Yukiko had hesitated when one of the boys had shouted her name, too slow to respond for his liking. He pointed it out to Hiroshi, who stood with a cigarette dangling carelessly from his lips. "You know," he said, flicking ash carelessly onto the floor, "I don't think she's taking this seriously." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a lighter, twirling it between his fingers, while giving Yukiko a look that froze her blood. It's about time she learned some respect. Before she could react, Hiroshi grabbed her arm roughly, yanking it forward. She screamed in protest as he flicked open the lighter and held the flame dangerously close to her skin. The heat licked at her forearm, threatening to burn, while the others watched eagerly. "Say you're sorry," Hiroshi ordered, his voice devoid of mercy. I'm sorry," Yukiko sobbed, struggling to pull her arm free as the flame edged closer. "No," he said with boredom, "you don't sound like you mean it." Her tear-filled eyes looked up at him pleadingly, but there was no recognition of her humanity in his gaze. To him, this wasn't a girl he had ambushed and imprisoned, it was a tool for his amusement, a vessel for his power. "Please, I'm sorry. Eventually he pulled the lighter away, not because of mercy but because he was satisfied for the moment. Tossing the lighter aside, he faced the group with a grin. "See? Easy. She's learning." The deep cuts of humiliation. Sometimes the hatred they inflicted was more emotional than it was physical. They would surround her in the kitchen or the living room, barking insults at her about her appearance, her worthlessness, her family. They'd mock her tears, mimicking the way she whimpered as if it were a joke. On particularly humiliating days they forced her to sing, to dance like a puppet for their sheer entertainment, their laughter stinging deeper than any slap or kick. "You're pathetic!" one of them scoffed, his disdain sharp as a knife. "Can't believe we wasted time catching you." But even through the torrent of abuse, Yukiko bit down hard on what little resistance she had left. She refused to let them see her completely break. When they shouted, she fought to hold her head high even if her body was trembling. When they laughed, she stared at the floor, willing herself to blend into the shadows. Her silence wasn't compliance, it was survival. She knew, even through her pain, that she had to keep hold of that small, flickering ember of self. Because if they extinguished it, she feared there would be nothing left of her at all. The family's desperate search. The morning after Yukiko's disappearance felt like any other day in the Aima household. Until it didn't. At first, her absence wasn't immediately alarming. Akiko, her mother, figured she had left early for school or taken an extra shift at the cafe. It wasn't unusual for Yukiko to slip out quietly, her shy nature often avoiding unnecessary attention. Takashi, her father, made his usual hurried breakfast while heading out to the factory where he worked long hours. But as the day edged into the afternoon, Akiko began to feel an unfamiliar gnawing at her stomach. Something wasn't right. By evening, that faint unease had snowballed into full-blown panic. Yukiko didn't come home. The tea she always had waiting for her father remained untouched. The little evening ritual where she'd coax her playful sister Haruna into reviewing homework didn't happen. And when Akiko called the cafe where Yukiko worked, the answer chilled her to the bone. Yukiko had left at her usual time the prior evening and never returned. It was as if the earth had shifted beneath Akiko's feet. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 8:30 p.m. now. The streets of their small town, though usually safe, were no place for someone alone at this hour. With trembling hands, Akiko picked up the phone, dialing Takashi at his workplace. The worry clinging to her voice was palpable when he answered. "Yukiko didn't come home," she whispered, her voice trembling, "and no one seems to know where she is." "What do you mean she didn't come home?" he barked, a sharp edge of disbelief in his tone. Takashi wasn't a man of emotions, stoic and practical, but in that moment his heart tightened as he heard the fear in Akiko's voice. Within minutes Takashi had rushed home, sweat streaking his shirt from the 12-hour factory shift. Together the Aima family scoured the neighborhood. Takashi pedaled furiously on his old bicycle, his flashlight spearing the darkness as he checked alleyways and dimly lit corners. Akiko dragged little Haruna along, knocking on the doors of neighbors she barely knew, asking the same dreadful question over and over. "Did you see Yukiko yesterday? Did she pass by here?" One by one, neighbors shook their heads. Some offered vague condolences, others gave hurried reassurances that she might have stayed with a friend or missed her way. But Akiko wasn't convinced. Yukiko was predictable, conscientious. Something had gone terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones. That night grew longer as minutes stretched into hours. Kenta, Yukiko's elder brother, joined the search after biking from his carpentry shop in the next town over, his face pale with worry. They checked every possible place she could have gone: her high school, the local library where she loved to sketch in peace, even the park under the cherry blossoms she often drew inspiration from. But there was nothing, not a single sign. Reporting to the police. By early morning, exhaustion and dread set in. With no other option, the Aimas approached the local police station. Akiko's hands shook as she clutched a photo of Yukiko. It was a snapshot of her smiling faintly in her school uniform, holding a sketchbook close to her chest. "She's missing," Akiko said, her voice hoarse but firm. "It's been nearly 24 hours since she left the cafe." The officers, seasoned in petty thefts and resolving harmless disputes in the quiet town, exchanged hesitant glances. "It hasn't been long enough to file an official missing persons report," one of them muttered. "Not long enough? She didn't come home," Takashi's voice thundered through the small station, startling everyone present. He rarely lost his temper, but now his fists clenched, his eyes fiery with desperation. The officer held up a calming hand. "Sir, it's not unusual for teenagers to go off for a night or two without telling anyone. Are you sure she isn't staying with a friend?" "Yukiko is not that kind of girl," Akiko interjected, her voice cracking. "She'd never leave without telling us. Something's happened to her, don't you understand?" Reluctantly, the police agreed to file a preliminary notice. They asked questions about Yukiko's routine, her relationships, and whether there were any disagreements at home. The Aimas answered everything, but frustration lingered. The officers' passive tone didn't fill them with hope. They didn't seem to fully grasp the urgency. The first clue. 2 days later, as Takashi retraced Yukiko's common routes for the 100th time, stopping to ask shopkeepers and street vendors if they had seen her, he stumbled upon something chilling. In a ditch by the roadside, tangled among fallen leaves, lay Yukiko's school bag. His heart stopped as he knelt down to pick it up. The bag looked disheveled, scuffed, as though it had been tossed carelessly. Inside, her sketchbook was still there, the edges of the pages smudged with dirt. The sight of her art, so familiar yet abandoned like discarded trash, made his chest tighten painfully. He immediately called Akiko, who rushed to the scene with Kenta. The bag confirmed what they feared most. Yukiko hadn't simply gotten lost or gone somewhere willingly. Someone had taken her. Hope meeting resistance. The discovery of the bag sparked a more active police investigation. Flyers with her face were distributed throughout the town. Police officers knocked on doors asking questions, but there were no leads. Nagano was a town where most people left their windows unlocked, where parents let their kids roam freely without worry. The idea of someone being kidnapped didn't sit easily with the locals. Most dismissed it with quiet murmurs. "She'll turn up," said one elderly neighbor, sipping tea on her porch. "Teenagers these days are unpredictable." Akiko bristled every time she heard such comments. The town's complacency was maddening. Many people were kind enough to help put up posters and spread the word, but deep down Akiko knew most of them believed Yukiko was just another rebellious teenager who'd eventually come home. But Akiko knew better. A mother knows. Every fiber in her being screamed that Yukiko wasn't safe. The toll on the family. As weeks passed with no word, the weight of Yukiko's absence bore down heavily on the family. Takashi buried himself in the search, refusing to even sleep. Akiko spent nights sobbing quietly in Yukiko's room, clinging to the faint scent of her daughter on the pillows. Kenta blamed himself for not being around more, his guilt manifesting in angry outbursts at dinner that left everyone silent. Haruna, too young to fully grasp the depth of what was happening, would sit by the window each evening waiting for her sister. "When is Kiko coming home, Mama?" she'd ask softly, her voice fragile like the tiny hands clinging to her mother's sleeve. Akiko would smile tightly, bracing against the ache in her heart. "Soon, sweetheart," she lied, tucking Haruna's hair behind her ear. "She'll come home soon." But soon never came. Growing despair, fading light. The Aimas continued to search tirelessly, but hope began to flicker out like a candle in the wind. Days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. With each passing hour, the possibility of finding Yukiko alive felt more and more like a cruel illusion. And yet, in the face of despair, Akiko still prayed. Takashi still combed the streets. Kenta still plastered flyers across every pole and shop window within miles. They refused to let go of the faintest chance, no matter how slim, that Yukiko could be found. After all, what else could a family do but cling to each other? And hope. The silence of outsiders. The house where Yukiko was held captive stood deceptively ordinary in the middle of a quiet residential area. It wasn't an abandoned dark corner of the wilderness or an eerie old structure tucked far from civilization. No, it stood in plain sight, surrounded by neatly tended houses with flower beds, clotheslines swaying gently in the breeze, and the distant hum of life that came with the peaceful Nagano neighborhood. Yet, within its walls, a world of unspeakable horrors was concealed, hidden behind curtained windows and locked doors. And in that silence, that absence of questions, that refusal to look too closely, lay a failing as cruel as the crime itself. Neighbors who chose silence. In a town where trust and community had always reigned, the faint whispers of doubt began to creep into the periphery of daily life. Some neighbors near the house where Yukiko was imprisoned had heard things. Echoes of shouting, bursts of laughter that didn't sound right at strange hours of the night. Some had even seen the men coming and going with hurried movements, their faces closed off, carrying beer bottles and odd bundles late into the evening. Yet no one said anything. Maybe it wasn't just trust, but discomfort, a refusal to step into the unknown. After all, in towns like Nagano, people didn't meddle in each other's affairs unless invited. What went on in someone's home was their business. Even so, seeds of discomfort had surely been planted when the more perceptive neighbors noticed that the house, though lively with activity, held a sour undercurrent. The loud, drunken voices spilling from its cracked windows seemed misplaced in the peaceful neighborhood, their joyless tones sharp and jarring. But turning away was easy. It was too easy. Looking the other way required no risk. It allowed them to cling to the illusion that their small town was still pristine, untouched by true evil. "She's not my daughter," one man had thought to himself, shaking his head as he passed the house one evening, hearing what sounded like a muffled scream masked by a slam of a door. "It's probably just some teenagers fooling around, no need to stick my nose into trouble." And he kept walking, clutching his briefcase tighter, as he hurried back to the warmth of his own family's dinner table. Another neighbor caught sight of a young woman's shadow occasionally against the frosted window glass. It was rare, but it was there. A slim figure against the murky space of yellow-lit curtains. He thought about how odd it was, wondered who she was and why she never appeared outside like the other women in the area. But his curiosity stopped there. Asking meant getting involved. Quietly he convinced himself it was none of his business, and moved on. Those too close to speak. While most of the neighbors feigned ignorance, a chilling reality began to unfold for the few who happened to overlap into the lives of the men. Up close, these people weren't fooled, not entirely. A shopkeeper down the street remembered the gang coming in groups to buy beers and cigarettes, their voices loud and boundaryless as they flirted inappropriately with customers or joked crudely with each other. The shopkeeper hated their energy, the way their laughter sounded fake, forced, edged with something dangerous. They would buy their things and leave, unbothered by the faint glares or the wary eyes tracking their paths out the door. "They scared me," the shopkeeper admitted to her husband one night, recounting an uneasy exchange with Hiroshi when she accidentally avoided eye contact too long. She told him how his smile seemed friendly at first but turned cold, sharp. "You think these kinds of people are harmless, but they're darkness." She let the words hang in the air before quickly changing the topic. After all, even if she felt uneasy, what could she really do? Men like Hiroshi thrived on intimidation. People didn't cross them, not unless they were willing to bear the consequences. Then there were the families of the men themselves, the parents, the cousins, the siblings who shared walls, bonds, and bloodlines with the captors. Did they know? What did their silences say? Hiroshi's younger cousin, Keita, suspected something after hearing his older relative on the phone one night. From the next room over, he caught snippets of Hiroshi bragging, "She's right where she belongs. Can't believe how soft she is. Like a little deer." The words were dripping with cruelty, and though Hiroshi never said a name or directly referenced Yukiko, Keita's intuition screamed that something was wrong, but he was 14 and terrified of his cousin. Hiroshi was the unspoken tyrant of their family, capable of snapping and turning his violent streak onto anyone who opposed him. And so, Keita stayed silent too, swallowing the lump in his throat as he avoided Hiroshi at family dinners, and prayed that what he suspected wasn't true. Apathy, born of fear. For others, it wasn't indifference alone but fear that paralyzed them. Those who lived closest to the gang heard far more than they ever let on. Some knew better than to provoke the wrong kind of attention. In small towns like theirs, trouble had a way of expanding like a virus to everyone connected with it. Confronting dangerous people could mean retribution. Not just for them, but for their families as well. "You hear them behind those walls, don't you?" one elderly neighbor whispered to her husband one evening as she looked out from an upstairs window toward the dim porch light of the gang's house. "Loud thuds, screaming." Her husband grunted from his armchair, adjusting his newspaper. "Just keep to yourself, we don't need trouble. Let the police deal with those thugs if it ever comes to it." But silence, they knew, was its own kind of complicity. Enabling through passivity. The silence of the outsiders wasn't merely inaction, it was enabling. Every suspicious glance redirected, every head turned the other way, every muttered excuse of, "It's none of my business," contributed to Yukiko's prolonged suffering. The walls of that house were not just physical barriers keeping Yukiko in, they were supported by the invisible walls of society's refusal to interfere or get involved. Most people weren't inherently heartless. They simply found comfort in waiting for someone else to make the first move. After all, it was easier to convince themselves that the sounds, the strange movements, the suspicious behaviors they noticed were none of their concern. It was easier to assume they were misunderstood rather than confront the idea that something truly vile was happening right under their noses. The weight of their silence. Yet, when the truth eventually came to light, when Yukiko's tragic fate became public knowledge, these same neighbors and bystanders were the first to hang their heads in shame. The shopkeeper who served Hiroshi and his group wished she had said something when Hiroshi's behavior sent cold shivers through her spine. The elderly couple regretted every single night they heard faint screams through their bedroom window, and wrote it off as drunken debauchery. And young Keita carried the burden of knowing he might have had an opportunity to spare Yukiko if only he'd spoken out. "Oh God, I knew something was wrong," a neighbor later confessed tearfully to reporters after the House of Horrors became a national scandal. "We all had our suspicions, but no one did anything. We just let it happen." The silence of outsiders wasn't the kind that stemmed from ignorance, it was the calculated, convenient kind, and that choice to remain uninvolved had helped cloak the nightmare in shadows for far too long. Yukiko's strong will. The days stretched on like an endless, suffocating loop. Each passing hour in that dreadful house tore away at Yukiko's strength, leaving behind bruises, scars, and a haunting silence in her soul. The gang had made sure to break her physically, tossing her into the depths of humiliation and suffering. Yet no matter how harsh the blows or how loud their words cut, Yukiko held on. Deep inside her battered body was a fire, small, flickering, but fiercely persistent. From the outside, it might have seemed like she had completely surrendered. Her tired eyes, the way her hands shook as she obeyed their commands, her silence in response to their taunts, it all painted the picture of someone who had given up. But beneath it all, Yukiko was far from broken. Her strong will was entwined with every tear she shed, every scream she stifled, and every humiliating task she forced herself to endure. This fight wasn't about pride or resistance anymore. It was about surviving long enough to see freedom again. Glimmers of defiance. The smallest acts of defiance became her lifeline. Though the gang robbed her of her ability to fight back openly, Yukiko clung to her humanity in small but powerful ways. When they threw cruel insults her way, she didn't let them see the full weight of her pain. When their shouts demanded immediate obedience, she purposely took an extra second before moving. She couldn't protest or refuse, but she could control the tiny spaces where her defiance remained alive. One evening, as Hiroshi barked orders for her to clean up their mess from a drinking spree, she knelt on the filthy floor and picked up the shards of a broken bottle. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, but her mind raced. She traced her fingers over the sharp edges of the broken glass, and for a moment, the idea of striking back flashed in her thoughts. The temptation burned like the cuts on her skin, but Yukiko was a pragmatist. She knew anger alone couldn't defeat men like Hiroshi. She needed something more: planning, timing, and above all, the will to endure until the right moment came. She carefully set the shard down, placing it under a crooked floorboard that she could reach later if she needed to. It wasn't much, But in that moment, it was enough. The smallest glimmers of rebellion reinforced her strength, refusing to lose hope. What kept her alive during those long, suffocating nights wasn't just the instinct to survive, it was hope. It was messy, fragile, and often fleeting, but it was there. Yukiko would think of her family whenever despair clawed at her heart. Late at night, alone in her dim, suffocating prison of a room, she'd close her eyes and picture her little sister Haruna's bright smile. She imagined the sound of her giggles, her excited stories about school. She thought about her father's stern but unwavering love, the way he silently showed his care through hard work and quiet acts of kindness. And her mother's soft voice, the way she used to hum while cooking, the way those arms offered warmth no matter how terrible things seemed. Her family became her tether to reality. Was her mother crying every night? Was little Haruna waiting by the window, asking when Kiko would come home? Did her father march through the streets, searching for her? Yukiko clung to the thought of them, willing herself to survive because she couldn't bear the thought of leaving them broken and hollow. "They will find me," she whispered to herself in the dark. Her voice shook as tears rolled down her cheeks, but she repeated it like a mantra. "They will find me. I just have to last. I just have to be strong." A desperate attempt. One night, when the laughter and shouts of her captors had dulled to drunken rumbles, Yukiko decided it was time to act. Her body screamed with pain, her muscles weak, and her spirit stretched thin, but something inside whispered that she couldn't wait any longer. If she didn't do something, if she didn't try, she feared that she might eventually lose even the fight inside her. Crawling cautiously on her hands and knees, she crept toward the door. The binds on her wrists had loosened slightly after days of wear, giving her just enough wiggle room to slip her hands free. Every movement sent sharp reminders of the bruises and cuts that covered her. But she pressed forward. She placed her ear against the wooden door and listened. Except for the sound of someone snoring heavily nearby, it appeared that most of them were either asleep or too drunk to notice her. Finding strength in the possibility of escape, Yukiko's heart raced. She spotted the shard of glass she had hidden from before, still tucked beneath the floorboard. Slowly and carefully, she reached for it, praying the worn wood wouldn't creak and alert her captors. With the shard of glass in hand, Yukiko tried to open the door, but it groaned loudly, making her freeze with terror. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might give her away. But when no footsteps approached, she inhaled shakily and continued. She had no clear plan, no direction, no idea of where to go once she made it outside, but the need to breathe free air drove her forward. She slipped into the hallway, taking deliberate, quiet steps toward the front door. The air smelled of beer, stale cigarettes, and unwashed clothes. Yukiko felt suffocated, but she pushed through. Her heart leapt in her chest as she reached the knob of the front door. She began to turn it, but that's when everything went wrong. "Where do you think you're going?" The voice froze her mid-motion. It was Hiroshi. The sharp, dangerous tone sliced through her hopes like a blade. Before she could react, he was on her, grabbing her wrist with a force that made her cry out in pain. Dragging her back into the main room, Hiroshi made a show of her failed attempt. "You thought you could outsmart us?" he snarled, waving the shard of glass she'd been gripping moments before. "I don't think so." The punishment was swift and brutal. The others joined in, their rage boiling over as they made her pay for daring to challenge their control. Yet even as they hurt her, Yukiko refused to feel shame for what she'd done. She had tried. It hadn't succeeded, but she had tried. And in that moment, she promised herself she'd try again. Unbreakable spirit. Though her body bore the weight of their punishments, her spirit remained steadfast. Yukiko knew she couldn't rely on strength alone. It would take cunning, patience, and an unshakable will to escape the horrors of that house. Every day they kept her alive was another day closer to freedom. They didn't realize it, but Yukiko wasn't just surviving. She was waiting, plotting, fighting in the only ways she could. "The more they do to me," she thought in the quiet moments, "the harder I'll fight back someday." Through her pain, despair, and endless torment, Yukiko's will burned steadily in the darkness, a fragile but brilliant flame that carried her through the nightmare. No matter how much they sought to extinguish it, they could never fully destroy the strongest part of her. The tragedy reaches its climax. By the time Yukiko's captivity had stretched into its 40th day, the House of Horrors reeked of desperation, fear, and unchecked madness. The gang, led by the controlling and increasingly volatile Hiroshi, had spiraled into chaos. Weeks of heavy drinking, gambling losses, arguments, and growing paranoia had cracked the fragile dynamic that held them together. Their laughter echoed less frequently, replaced by angry shouting matches and bitter insults. The dominance they exerted over Yukiko was no longer enough to appease them. The novelty of their cruelty started to dull, and the tension inside the house reached a violent boiling point. For Yukiko, every passing second felt like an eternity. The bruises on her body had faded and darkened, making way for fresh ones layered over older injuries. She had stopped keeping track of the days. Her world had become a monotonous cycle of pain, exhaustion, and survival. Yet she still clung to the fragile ember of hope burning somewhere deep inside her, feeding herself small thoughts of freedom, of her family, of a life beyond those suffocating walls. But even her resilience, her will to survive this torment, was beginning to waver. The breaking point. On the fateful evening of the 40th day, everything unraveled. The gang's repeated failures at gambling and Hiroshi's growing frustration over their unraveling plans created an atmosphere thicker and more volatile than gas fumes waiting for a match. Hiroshi, once so dangerously calculating, was now unhinged. His losses weighed heavily on him, not just financially, but as blows to the dominance he prided himself on. The inferiority he felt fueled his anger, and that rage needed a target. Yukiko had always been their scapegoat, the unfortunate outlet for their frustrations. But that night was different. That night, she became the focus of their collective rage in a way that surpassed anything she had suffered in the past. It began with Hiroshi's fury after a particularly heated gambling match went sour. "It's all falling apart!" he shouted, slamming a beer bottle onto the table, causing shards of glass to scatter across the floor. "Everything!" His voice boomed through the tiny house, silencing the others momentarily. The air was electric with his anger, his outbursts unpredictable and often contagious. One of the younger men, encouraged by Hiroshi's outburst, gestured toward Yukiko, who sat curled in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Her once bright eyes had dulled from endless suffering. "She's been too quiet," the boy said, his grin unsettling. "Maybe it's her fault. Maybe she's bad luck." Hiroshi paused, his eyes narrowing. Drunken thoughts began to swirl in his mind, irrational and cruel. His gaze fell on Yukiko, and for a moment she felt the weight of his cold, calculating stare. "Yeah," he muttered softly, his voice almost soothing, but it quickly turned venomous, sharp and biting like the edge of a knife. "Maybe she is. Maybe this is all because of her." Yukiko didn't speak. She didn't dare. Her injuries throbbed as she sat perfectly still, trying to suppress the panic welling inside her chest. She had seen this before, night after night, their anger flaring and then subsiding. But this time, something was different, something far more dangerous. Hiroshi stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He crossed the room, stepping over the broken glass without care, and crouched in front of her. "Hey, bad luck, girl," he whispered, his voice dripping with mockery. "We've been too nice to you. I think it's about time you pay." A descent into violence. What followed was a scene that would haunt everyone in that house, whether by guilt or the grim sense of power they experienced for the rest of their lives. Hiroshi reached out and yanked Yukiko to her feet by her arm, dragging her into the center of the room like a doll. She stumbled, her knees buckling under her weak frame. "Let her go, man!" one of the gang muttered half-heartedly, but Hiroshi silenced him with a glare so fierce the words died in his throat. "Shut up!" Hiroshi barked. "This is happening!" Yukiko barely had time to process the cruelty unfolding. Blows came from every direction, slaps, punches, and kicks, each one robbing her of more air, more strength. They unleashed every ounce of pent-up frustration on her frail body. She cried out at first, her voice raw with pain, but her cries soon faded into silent gasps as every inch of her screamed in agony. Even the others, the same men who had once reveled in tormenting her, began to back away. Some returned to their chairs, finding their beers more interesting, guilt or perhaps discomfort, pulling them away from the storm Hiroshi had unleashed. But no one intervened, no one spoke up. Hiroshi was a tyrant and they were cowards, unwilling to put themselves in his crosshairs. At some point, Yukiko collapsed to the floor, unable to move, her body limp and battered. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the wooden floorboards. Hiroshi's chest heaved as he looked down at her, his fists still clenched. He seemed to snap out of a trance, his own breath hitching when he realized she wasn't moving. "Get up!" he hissed, then louder, "Get up!" But Yukiko didn't. She couldn't. One of the gang members, his face pale, cleared his throat. I think she's—" The words stuck in his mouth, the implication too horrifying to say out loud. Panic and cover-up reality hit them all at once. Panic replaced cruelty, and the bravado that filled the air moments earlier evaporated, leaving behind nothing but fear. Hiroshi stood frozen, staring at Yukiko's broken body. "She's not dead," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "She's not—" But she was. The room erupted into frantic whispers and hurried decisions. "What do we do? This isn't my problem. We'll go to jail!" Every voice in the room grew louder, more desperate, as they scrambled to pin the blame on anyone but themselves. Hiroshi, however, stayed unnervingly calm amid the chaos. His mind worked furiously, calculating how to fix the unfixable. "We get rid of her," he finally said, his voice low but commanding. "We get rid of her and this never happened." No one argued. Fear kept them compliant. Under Hiroshi's orders, they stuffed Yukiko's lifeless body into a large suitcase, her limbs bending unnaturally to fit inside. They carried the suitcase out of the house under the cover of night, walking with staggering guilt and paranoia. Hiroshi led them to a secluded spot, a patch of grass near an abandoned lot, far enough from anyone who might stumble upon it. There, with trembling hands, they poured cement over the suitcase, encasing Yukiko's body, as if burying the truth would keep their sins hidden forever. When the cement dried, they left the spot in silence, their shadows stretching in the moonlight. But Yukiko's memory, her suffering, would not stay buried. The finality of tragedy. Yukiko's tragic death marked the climax of a story that should never have been written. Her courage, her endurance, and her will to survive had carried her through weeks of unspeakable torment, but even those could not shield her from the darkest depths of human cruelty. That night, the world became a darker place, not just because of what was done to her, but because of how many people inside and outside that house let it happen. And yet even in death, Yukiko's spirit would persist, a silent testament to the weight of the lives she touched and the fight she endured. Her tragedy, though devastating, would eventually light a spark that would demand justice, not just for her, but for all those who might suffer a fate like hers. The truth comes to light. It wasn't an immediate discovery, but a slow, agonizing unearthing of what no one had dared to imagine. More than a month had passed since Yukiko's disappearance, and the Aima family's tireless search had begun to lose traction under the weight of despair. The missing posters with Yukiko's face, once crisp and hopeful, had faded under rain and sun, their edges curling against telephone poles and shop windows. Neighbors quietly avoided conversations with the family, in part because no one knew what to say, and in part because moving on seemed easier. But for Akiko, Takashi, Kenta, and Haruna, there was no moving on. Yukiko wasn't just a girl on a faded flyer. She was their heart, and her absence was a wound that refused to heal. Everyone in the small town of Nagano seemed to cling to denial. Maybe Yukiko had run away. Maybe she'd hitched a ride to Tokyo, seeking the thrill of city life like so many other teenagers. It was easier to imagine anything but the unthinkable. But the Aima family knew better. Yukiko wasn't someone who'd go silent, not without a reason. Deep down, Akiko could feel it. Her daughter wasn't just lost. Something terrible had happened. And it all began to unravel because of one oversight, one mistake. The arrest that sparked it all. In a neighboring district of Nagano, a young member of Hiroshi's gang, Riku, the youngest and most impulsive of the group, was arrested on unrelated charges. It was a routine bust, one of those moments where arrogance and carelessness led police right to his door. A fight at a gambling den had spiraled out of control, leaving Riku with blood on his hands and witnesses willing to talk. The charges themselves were unrelated to Yukiko's case, but Riku had always been the weakest link, the one who couldn't keep his mouth shut. During his interrogation, the officers noticed his cocky demeanor falter. They asked him about the gambling fight, but his responses were evasive, filled with nervous laughter and incomplete sentences. And then, almost as if he couldn't help himself, Riku let something slip, a small, offhand comment that made the officer conducting the interview sit up straighter. "Man, this isn't even the worst thing we've done," Riku had muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the officer. His words were laced with a nervous chuckle, but the weight of what he'd said hung heavy in the room. "What do you mean by that?" the officer pressed, his tone shifting from casual to sharp in an instant. Riku froze. He hadn't meant to say it. Panic flickered across his face as his brain scrambled for a way to backtrack. "Nothing," he said quickly. I was just talking nonsense." But the officer wasn't buying it. Over the course of the next few hours they pressed Riku harder, exploiting every crack in his bravado. and slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to come out. At first it was vague. Riku spoke about a girl, without naming her, about a group of them keeping her somewhere. Details slipped through his lips in fragments: a quiet house, the leader Hiroshi, a suitcase. He stopped short of admitting her fate, but it was enough. Enough to make the police look closer, uncovering the House of Horrors. Once Riku's statement was taken seriously, local authorities connected the dots and zeroed in on Hiroshi. They obtained a search warrant for the property he occupied, a house that had gone largely unnoticed by neighbors despite the strange activity surrounding it. When officers arrived, the sight that greeted them was disturbing. The house was filthy, littered with empty beer bottles, cigarette butts, and crumpled fast food wrappers. The air inside was heavy with the smell of sweat, alcohol, and mildew, a stench so thick it seemed alive. But it wasn't just the mess that unsettled the officers, it was the quiet. A stillness that felt haunted. They moved carefully through each room, their boots crunching against broken glass and discarded trash. The evidence of chaos was everywhere. A stained mattress shoved into a corner, ropes frayed from use, a forgotten shoe that looked far too small to belong to any of the house's male inhabitants. The unease among the officers grew as they pushed deeper into the home, and then, in a grim, cluttered corner of the house, they found it. A large suitcase, expertly hidden beneath layers of debris. The room itself smelled rank, as though something had been rotting just beneath the surface. When they opened the suitcase, the horror of what they had uncovered became undeniable. Beneath layers of hastily packed cement was the fragile, mangled body of Yukiko Aima. The room went silent as the officers processed what they were seeing. Some turned away, swallowing hard against the bile rising in their throats. Others stood frozen, their minds racing as they realized the magnitude of the discovery. "We've got her!" one officer whispered hoarsely into his radio. "It's the missing girl. The news breaks." It didn't take long for the news to break. By the next morning the small town of Nagano was buzzing with grim whispers. Local journalists swarmed the scene, their cameras capturing every angle of the house where Yukiko's final days had played out. The story was no longer just a local tragedy. It became a national scandal, splashed across newspapers and television screens across Japan. Yukiko's name was everywhere. Her smiling face from a school photo was juxtaposed with equally chilling images of the house, the suspects, and the suitcase where she had been found. It was a story that gripped the country, a tale of small-town innocence shattered, of evil hiding in plain sight. For the Aima family, the confirmation of Yukiko's fate was both a devastating blow and a grim relief. "At least we know," Akiko whispered through tears when a detective informed them of the discovery. She clutched the photo of her daughter tightly to her chest, her body racked with sobs. "At least we can bring her home!" It was a sentiment echoed by Takashi, though his pain took on a quieter form. He stood silently, gripping his wife's shoulder as the news set in. Kenta punched the wall of their small kitchen, muttering curses under his breath as he fought against the wave of guilt threatening to consume him. And young Haruna, too young to fully understand the finality of it all, simply cried into her mother's lap, asking over and over, "Why can't we see her? When is she coming back?" The aftermath. Alongside the grief came anger. The people of Nagano were outraged, not just at the gang who had committed such horrific acts, but at themselves. The silence of neighbors, the unwillingness to intervene when things seemed amiss, it all became part of the conversation. How had this happened in their own community? How had Yukiko's cries gone unheard for so long? The family's small house turned into a gathering place as old friends, neighbors, and even strangers came to pay their respects. Flowers and letters were left near Yukiko's favorite park bench, creating a memorial that grew by the day, yet none of it could dull the ache of her absence. A national reckoning. Yukiko's tragedy sparked a nationwide reckoning. Questions were raised about the leniency of laws protecting juvenile offenders, the efficiency of police investigations, and the accountability of communities as a whole. Her story became a rallying cry for change, her name a symbol of the innocent lives endangered by complacency. But for the Aima family, no amount of outrage, no changes in law or policy could bring Yukiko back. All they had left were memories, and a relentless determination to make sure her story would never be forgotten. The trial, and the controversial sentencing. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was bursting with tension. Reporters filled every available seat in the gallery, their pens poised, notebooks open, and cameras flashing like restless fireflies. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered for weeks, holding posters with Yukiko's picture, signs demanding justice, and banners calling for tougher penalties for violent crimes. The Aima family, utterly broken but determined to see the case through, quietly walked into the courthouse each day, their faces weathered by grief. The defendants, Hiroshi and the members of his gang, walked in behind them, escorted by guards, their heads bowed. Some looked indifferent, others wore expressions of poorly concealed nervousness. Hiroshi, however, sat tall, his trademark arrogance shining through the cracks in his otherwise blank mask. For him, this trial was another game, a challenge he thought he could navigate with his usual cunning. The prosecution's case. From the outset, the prosecution painted a blistering picture of the crime, calling it a tragedy of unprecedented cruelty. They outlined the events of Yukiko's 41 days of captivity, describing in detail the physical, emotional, and psychological abuse she endured. Evidence from fragments of rope found at the scene to recordings of the defendant's own drunken boasts painted a horrifying timeline of what had taken place within the walls of that suburban house. The prosecutor was relentless. He held up pieces of evidence, a photograph of the shattered kitchen tiles where Yukiko had been forced to crawl, part of the blood-stained floorboards pried from the house, and finally the infamous suitcase still bearing the grooves of hardened cement that had encased it. "These 4 young men," the prosecutor declared, his voice sharp as the crack of a whip through the courtroom, "took it upon themselves to strip a girl of her freedom. They defiled her humanity, and when they grew bored of their cruelty, they snuffed out her life with unthinkable violence. They treated her as disposable. And yet, here they sit, looking for mercy that they never once gave her." Akiko and Takashi sat silently in the front row, their faces carved with pain as the details of their beloved Yukiko's suffering were dissected. Kenta gripped the edge of the bench so hard his knuckles went white, quietly glaring at the defendants. Little Haruna, too young to attend the trial, stayed home with family friends, spared from hearing the nightmare described in all its stark detail. The defense's argument, youth as a shield. From the beginning, the defense sought to minimize their client's actions. They argued not out of innocence but desperation, claiming that the crime had been the result of reckless youth, an unfortunate series of events that had spiraled out of control. "These boys didn't mean to kill Yukiko," the lead defense attorney said, his tone thick with faux sympathy. "This was not premeditated. It was a tragedy rooted in poor judgment, substance abuse, and immaturity. My clients are young, impressionable, and capable of rehabilitation. They made a mistake, an egregious mistake, but they are not monsters." The defendants played their part perfectly. They wore tailored suits and somber faces, looking younger and more vulnerable than they had in any of the footage or photos released in the months prior. Hiroshi, ever the opportunist, even appeared to cry during proceedings, clutching a tissue and bowing his head as if overwhelmed with shame. The strategy was clear. They leaned heavily on the fact that all 4 men were juveniles, ages ranging from 17 to 19 at the time of the crime. Under Japanese law, this technicality provided them protection from the harshest penalties reserved for adults. They would argue that the boys had been products of their environment, victims of poor upbringing, and susceptible to peer pressure. For the Aima family, this was salt in an already gaping wound. Calling them boys made them sound harmless, like mischievous children who had broken a window instead of taking a life in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Testimonies that shook the courtroom. The most powerful moments during the trial came from the testimonies of those who had to face the guilt of what they had enabled or failed to intervene in. A neighbor, trembling on the stand, admitted hearing yelling and even faint screams late at night. "I thought it was just drunk young men. I didn't think it was anything serious," she whispered, her voice cracking. Another testimony came from the shopkeeper who had sold the gang beer and cigarettes. He remembered their rowdy, crude conversations, but had dismissed their behavior as typical of reckless teens in the neighborhood. "I never imagined something like this," he muttered as he bowed his head. The most devastating testimony, however, came from Akiko herself. She stood before the court holding one of Yukiko's sketchbooks, its edges worn from use. With a trembling hand, Akiko opened the book to one of her daughter's carefully drawn landscapes of their garden at home. "She loved drawing," Akiko said, fixing her gaze on Hiroshi, her voice shaking but resolute. "She loved life. She deserved more than this. She deserved to grow up. She deserved safety, and they stole that from her." Her words carried through the courtroom, raw and red with pain, and even the most seasoned observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The verdict and public backlash. After weeks of harrowing testimonies, the court finally delivered a verdict. Hiroshi and the other gang members were found guilty on multiple counts of abduction, abuse, and murder. Yet the sentences that followed made the room erupt in outrage. Hiroshi, as the gang leader, received the harshest punishment, 20 years imprisonment. The others received lighter sentences ranging from 7 to 15 years, no death penalty, no life sentences without parole. The presiding judge cited their young ages, claiming that their futures should not be completely erased, despite the gravity of their crimes. As juveniles, they still have the capacity for rehabilitation, the judge stated. The courtroom broke into chaos as the sentences were read. Members of the Aima family erupted in anger. Kenta shouted, "That's it? That's all they get for what they did?" He was quickly silenced and escorted out by officers. Akiko and Takashi sat frozen, disbelief etched into their faces as the weight of the injustice sunk in. Outside the courthouse, the public backlash was immediate. Protesters filled the streets holding signs with messages like, "Yukiko deserves justice and laws are failing victims." A wave of rage against the legal protections for juvenile offenders swept across the nation, sparking debates on talk shows, in newspaper columns, and in parliament. A controversial legacy for the Aima family, the sentences felt like another betrayal. How could the law protect the people who had taken Yukiko from them? How could they walk free in a matter of years, while Yukiko's absence would stretch for eternity? Even after the trial, Hiroshi and the others showed no signs of true remorse. Reports from prison detailed Hiroshi as an arrogant inmate, often bragging about how much power he had once held. The idea that such men could one day rejoin society was both horrifying and infuriating to the public. For years, Yukiko's case fueled discussions about overhauling Japan's juvenile justice system. Politicians debated raising the age for criminal responsibility, while activists pushed for harsher sentences for violent crimes committed by minors. But for Akiko and Takashi, no system could repair the hole left in their lives. They didn't just lose a daughter, they lost their trust in society's ability to protect the innocent, injustice in the name of mercy. The trial may have ended, but the pain endured by the Aima family, and the anger reverberating across the public, continued to linger long after the sentencing. While Hiroshi and his gang would eventually serve their time and return to the world outside, Yukiko would remain forever frozen in memory. A young girl with dreams in her sketchbook, taken too soon by a system that failed to protect her. The lingering consequences. The trial had ended, the sentences handed down, and the courtroom had emptied. But for the Aima family and the small town of Nagano, it wasn't over. Not really. The consequences of Yukiko's death carved themselves into every corner of their lives, a shadow that lingered over everything and everyone. Justice, as it was meted out, felt incomplete, a hollow gesture that left behind a gaping void where Yukiko should have been. Her death didn't just end a vibrant young life, it left scars on her family, her community, on the very fabric of trust that had once held Nagano together. And for those who had perpetrated such unspeakable horrors, the punishment they received would prove to be just a fraction of the burden they carried, or perhaps chose not to carry, once they left their prison cells. The stains of their actions seeped far beyond the years they spent behind bars, stretching long into their murky futures, the family's unending grief. For the Aima family, there was no recovery, there was no moving on. Yukiko wasn't a tragedy they could leave in the past. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, a light that had once illuminated their small house with warmth and laughter. And without her, that house felt colder, emptier. Akiko, Yukiko's mother, retreated from the world entirely in the years following the trial. The woman who used to hum while making dinner, who once smoothed her children's hair with gentle, reassuring hands, seemed to vanish after Yukiko's death. Her grief consumed her. She spent her days in Yukiko's room holding her daughter's sketchbooks, flipping through the pages as though the soft edges of the drawings could somehow bring her back. The outlines of cherry blossoms, rolling hills, and fantastic creatures were still there, but Yukiko wasn't, and the pain of her absence became a weight Akiko carried without relief. Takashi focused on work, throwing himself into long hours at the factory, avoiding coming home to a house that no longer felt like a home. Quiet and stoic before, he became even more withdrawn, his silence now a shield against his crumbling emotions. On rare nights when the moonlight poured through the window and the rest of the house was asleep, he allowed himself to cry quietly into his hands. But he would wipe away the tears by morning, putting on the armor he needed to get through another day of pretending that life could ever be normal again. Kenta, Yukiko's older brother, carried his grief differently. He internalized it as guilt, replaying the weeks leading up to Yukiko's disappearance over and over in his mind, as though he could pinpoint the exact moment he could have stopped it. "I should have protected her," he told himself again and again, his anger sharpening, not just toward the monsters who had taken her but toward himself. His once calm demeanor fractured, replaced by a fiery need to make up for his perceived failures. He pushed himself harder at work, picked fights he couldn't win, and slowly isolated himself from those who wanted to comfort him. And then there was Haruna, too young to fully understand Yukiko's death when it happened, who spent years growing into an understanding that the world was far crueler than she had realized. At first she simply waited by the window every night for her sister to come home, swinging her legs absent-mindedly while staring down the dark streets. When it became clear Yukiko wasn't coming back, her innocence was replaced with quiet sadness. She would whisper about Yukiko when no one else was listening, talking to her as though she could still hear her. "I hope you're happy there, Kiko," she would say softly, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit Yukiko had given her. The family functioned, but just barely. Meals were eaten in silence, birthdays passed in muted recognition, and the ghost of Yukiko lingered in every corner of the house. She was gone, but her absence was everywhere. The town that wanted to forget Nagano, too, felt the aftershocks of the tragedy. For months after the trial, the once sleepy town buzzed with uneasy tension. Murmurs about Yukiko's death hung over local markets and schoolyards. Neighbors eyed each other with a mix of suspicion and guilt, quietly wondering who could have done more to save her. But time has a cruel way of silencing things, and eventually, the chatter faded. The town began to erase Yukiko's memory in subtle ways, not from malice, but because it was easier to pretend nothing had happened. The house where she was kept remained empty for years, its windows dark and curtains permanently drawn. No one wanted to live there, no one wanted to go near it. Children dared each other to step onto its lawn, whispering ghost stories in hushed voices, but the grown-ups passed it without comment, as though looking at it too long might bring back the nightmare. Stores that once put up flyers with Yukiko's face eventually replaced them with posters for sales and festival announcements. The news cycle moved on to fresher tragedies, and life in Nagano returned to its calm, predictable rhythm. But the cracks were still there, too faint for outsiders to notice but always present for those who lived through it. The price of freedom for the guilty. The men who had taken Yukiko's life served their sentences, but prison didn't undo what they had done. For Hiroshi and his gang, the years behind bars stripped them of freedom but little else. Hiroshi, ever the ringleader, continued to foster a reputation inside prison as a manipulative, calculating presence. Reports from guards detailed a man who had not learned remorse, only how to navigate the system to his advantage. When he was finally released, he disappeared into the anonymity of city life, but the stain of his crimes followed him. Every job application, every lease application reminded him of his past. Employers turned him away, landlords refused him housing, and whispers of his deeds spread behind his back. The younger members of the gang fared no better. Their return to society was met with scorn, an invisible scarlet letter branding them as monsters. Some tried to start over, taking menial jobs and keeping their heads down to avoid drawing attention. But in quiet moments, the weight of what they had done crept back in. Riku, the youngest and most unstable of the group, fell into a downward spiral of addiction and petty crime, unable to reconcile the horrors he had helped inflict. Although the law had granted them the chance to rebuild their lives, societal judgment was inescapable. The people around them didn't forget what had happened, and neither did they. A ripple effect. The consequences of Yukiko's death didn't end with her family or the men who had taken her life. It spread outward, touching neighbors, teachers, journalists, and even strangers who had only read about her. In schools across Japan, teachers used Yukiko's story as a cautionary tale about trust and the dangers of complacency. Parents became more cautious, more protective, warning their children against strangers in ways they hadn't before. Community meetings focused on rebuilding trust and pushing for more community intervention, though the lessons often came too late. Yukiko became a symbol beyond Nagano's borders, a reminder of what could happen when evil goes unchecked, when neighbors turn their heads, and when society places rules above justice. The pain that never fades. Years passed, but for the Aima family time couldn't heal. Yukiko's name became known throughout Japan, her story referenced in debates about laws, policies, and the role of communities. But for her family, she wasn't a symbol, she was theirs. She was the bubbly girl with her sketchbooks, the young woman who dreamed of being an artist, the daughter and sister they had lost. And in the quiet corners of their lives, they carried her with them. Akiko still visited her daughter's room, smoothing her hand over the sheets as though Yukiko had just left it that morning. Takashi still walked the same streets he had searched so desperately, his flashlight left at home now, but his heart still scanning every corner. Kenta still worked like a man possessed, though now his energy was channeled into mentoring young boys, hoping to guide someone else away from the path his sister's killers had taken. And Haruna, now grown, sat at the same desk Yukiko once had, surrounded by her drawings, determined to keep her sister's memory alive in her own quiet way. A legacy of lessons. The consequences of Yukiko's death weren't just about the pain, it was in how she changed the people she left behind. Nagano learned to listen harder, families became closer, and though Yukiko's story was one of unimaginable horror, it also became one of resilience, the spark that lit conversations about justice, compassion, and the relentless pursuit of a better world. The legacy left behind, Yukiko Aima's story was not simply a tragedy, it became a legacy. What happened to her sent shockwaves across Japan, opening wounds and demanding that society take a hard look at itself. It was a chilling reminder of how innocence could be snuffed out by cruelty and neglect. But it was also a story that inspired change. Change in how communities listen, how laws are enforced, and how families and neighbors protect one another. Her death became the catalyst for conversations about justice, humanity, and responsibility that echoed far beyond her small town of Nagano. Yet while the nation debated, mourned, and began slowly to change, Yukiko's true legacy lay in the lives she had touched, the lessons her story carried, and the determination of those left behind to make sure her spirit would not fade into the shadows. A family's determination. For the Aima family, Yukiko was never just a victim, and her memory was more than the sum of her tragic final days. To them, she would always be their daughter, their sister, the girl who lit up their world with her shy smile and boundless creativity. Her mother, Akiko, clung to Yukiko's memory with fierce devotion. She made it her life's mission to preserve her daughter's legacy, refusing to let Yukiko's story end as just another name in the headlines. Akiko began speaking at community gatherings and schools, sharing Yukiko's love of art, her dreams, and her gentle spirit alongside the distressing details of what had torn her away. She became a voice for victims, urging parents to teach their children about the dangers of predatory behavior and warning communities to recognize the importance of vigilance. "It's not enough to love your children," she would say, her voice trembling but determined. "You must also fight for them, protect them, and help them navigate the dark places in this world. If someone had spoken up, if someone had cared just a little more, maybe my Yukiko would still be here." Meanwhile, Takashi, Yukiko's father, found his own way of honoring her memory. Though he never spoke publicly, his work ethic took on a new purpose. He quietly funded local programs aimed at providing after-school activities for teenagers, ensuring they had the kind of safe and nurturing spaces that could steer them away from the paths Hiroshi and his gang had taken. In creating these programs, Takashi hoped to save other families from the kind of heartache his own endured. Yukiko's older brother Kenta transformed his guilt into action. Haunted by thoughts of what he could have done differently, he began working with counselors and juvenile organizations to mentor troubled youths, particularly young men who showed signs of falling into violent or dangerous lifestyles. He reminded them of Yukiko, not of her death but of her life, her humanity. "It's never too late to choose to be better," he'd tell them, his voice heavy with both anger and sorrow. "You don't have to leave someone else in pain to feel powerful. That's not real strength." And perhaps most profoundly, Haruna, Yukiko's younger sister, grew up determined to keep her sister alive through her own actions. Inspired by Yukiko's love for drawing, Haruna began pursuing art herself, dedicating her work to her older sister. She once painted a vivid mural in the local park, near Yukiko's favorite bench, depicting cherry blossoms and fields of flowers, a vision of peace and beauty. Beneath it, she added a simple inscription, "In memory of Yukiko Aima. May her dreams live on in all of us." A national wake-up call. Yukiko's death transcended the boundaries of her small town and became a symbol for systemic failures that went far beyond Nagano. It ignited outrage across Japan, putting the spotlight on issues that had long been ignored: insufficient protections for women, lenient laws for juvenile offenders, and societal complacency when confronting uncomfortable truths. The lenient sentencing of Hiroshi and his gang sparked waves of protests across the country. Activists took to the streets demanding reform, holding placards adorned with portraits of Yukiko and slogans like, "Justice for Yukiko" and "No mercy for monsters." Debates raged across newsrooms, social media, and kitchen tables, questioning how such heinous crimes could result in what many viewed as inadequate punishment. Lawmakers faced mounting pressure to reform the juvenile justice system. In a nation where age often acted as a shield against harsher punishment, Yukiko's case became the rare exception that forced public officials to reconsider their stance on how young offenders should be treated in cases of extreme violence. Parliamentary discussions led to incremental but significant changes. The age of criminal responsibility for severe crimes was lowered, and new guidelines were introduced to hold juvenile offenders accountable in cases where their actions mirrored those of adult perpetrators. Community leaders, schools, and civic organizations also took Yukiko's story to heart. Programs were established to improve neighborhood awareness and encourage early intervention. Seminars on identifying warning signs of abuse or criminal behavior became commonplace in schools. Teachers and local police were trained to collaborate more effectively, ensuring a quicker response when someone was reported missing. Yukiko's name became a rallying cry for these initiatives, her memory a painful but powerful reminder of why vigilance matters, changing families and communities. In homes across Japan, parents began having conversations they'd once avoided. Mothers told their daughters about the importance of caution, of trusting their instincts. Fathers vowed to watch more closely over their children, asking questions they might have previously dismissed. Families sat at dinner tables and discussed Yukiko, her tragedy becoming a teachable moment not just about safety but about empathy, about being the kind of people who look out for one another. Meanwhile, Nagano itself quietly transformed. Though the town still bore the trauma of Yukiko's story, it also began to heal in its own way. The local police force implemented new protocols, requiring officers to investigate missing persons immediately rather than waiting the customary 48 hours, ensuring that families like the Aimas would not have to fight so hard to be heard in the future. The house where Yukiko had been held remained abandoned for years, a place avoided by tourists and residents alike. But rather than allowing it to linger as a haunted symbol, the community came together to repurpose it. By vote, it was transformed into a youth center, offering counseling, mentorship, and art classes, programs designed to steer young men and women away from paths of violence and toward futures of promise and respect. The transformation wasn't perfect, nor was it complete. Many in Nagano still carried guilt. Neighbors who heard something but said nothing, shopkeepers who felt unease but stayed silent, classmates who hadn't noticed Yukiko was gone until it was too late. But amid the sorrow, there was an undeniable truth. Yukiko had taught them all to be better, even if it came at the cost of her life. A legacy set in art and advocacy. In the years following her death, Yukiko's artwork took on newfound significance. Her sketches, once the private expressions of a shy girl with big dreams, became cherished artifacts of her legacy. Exhibitions were held in her honor, showcasing her talent and giving a face to the name that had come to symbolize so much. One of her illustrations, a delicately drawn cherry blossom tree with branches stretching skyward, became iconic. It was printed on flyers, banners, and even tattooed on some of her supporters. To many it symbolized resilience, the ability to grow and bloom even in the harshest conditions. In addition to art, the Yukiko Foundation was established, funded by both local initiatives and national donors inspired by her story. The foundation focused on supporting victims of kidnapping, abuse, and trauma, providing scholarships for young artists, and promoting awareness campaigns to prevent future tragedies. The story that refused to die. Decades later, Yukiko's name still carried weight. She became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of transformation. Her life, though cut short, inspired a movement, a shift in how people thought about safety, justice, and the responsibility of both individuals and society at large. Her legacy wasn't in the cruelty she endured, but in the change she inspired. It lived on in the laughter of children walking safely to school, in the murals painted by her sister, in the laws that bore her name, and in the hearts of a family that refused to let her be forgotten. Yukiko's story was proof that even in the darkest of nightmares, light could emerge, guiding others toward a better, kinder, and safer world. And though she was gone, her spirit remained, a whispered promise carried on the wind. Never again.